Hey. So, just finished up ideology. And I wanted to talk about it a little bit. First thing is I like to look at the components, and there's a few points I had to bring up with them. Counters. Okay, first of all the components for this are absolutely gorgeous. This is Z-Man Games, and I think they go out of their way on components in general. But this has to be one of the most pleasing games tactily that I've ever had. The counters are these wonderful, wonderful things. I didn't have to clip them at all. One thing is they basically fell out of the counter tree. That's cool. I mean, they delivered me a full set of counters. Nothing was missing. They had a good way of packaging them. And they have this wonderful texture. Actually, everything in this game, except for the rulebook, has this great texture. It just... The only thing, the cards are fantastic, and like I said, anybody who puts a condom on these cards, they're losing what I'm concerned is part of the most important part of the game. Oh, that just feels good. I would compare it to Clash of Arms' maps, which are just it's so beautiful to touch. But anyway, we got these nice big tiles, which are perfectly fitted for the cards, as we saw when we played. It takes up a lot of space, barely fit on my table to play things out with 5 players towards the end of the game. It was kind of hard to tell what was in the neutral area as opposed to controlled by someone. It's hard to move things around because you have to keep all the cards together, etc. with their tile. These were a little hard to shuffle. The actual deck of cards, I don't want to pull them out because they'll disorganize. I've got them kind of sorted in the box. It comes in a nice little setup. It allows you that. They're not too bad to shuffle, a little tricky, and it's important, since they're all sorted at the beginning, to get them shuffled. And also they'll tend to conglomerate between plays because you'll have, you know, a set of X number of each on each country tile. And they'll just tend to stack that way. So you're going to need to shuffle well. You might need to shuffle fairly well a couple times in the game, and it probably takes a minute or so to shuffle the deck, your personal deck fairly well. I would guess that the original game didn't have quite enough of these cards. I think it's much better. One of the variants, I don't want to say options because that disturbed someone, but yeah, one of the options it was to play with the original deck of cards, and you just remove, I think, 4 or 5 of each type from a player's deck, from every player's deck. I think that's just silly. I think the game actually needs the extra cards, and that was a good decision to take that. Okay. One of the first things that I mentioned in my intro was the history or the feel of the game. And after playing it, I feel a little bit more comfortable that I can do a little bit of dancing like I do in 18XX to try to explain what's going on there and say, yeah, this is a historical, believable story to some extent. For example, think about imperialists. So, first of all, for me to come up with that kind of feeling, I can't say it's the whole 20th century. I would say post-World War I. For me to come up with the imperialist position, and the imperialist position should be huge before World War I, but post-World War I, they're reasserting their imperialist position. The Commonwealth is essentially being built as this special set of nations with certain beliefs and certain trading advantages. And I think that's one way of looking at them that makes them more understandable, where you do actually have to develop nations, and you might find other nations gravitating more into your sphere of influence. But then, let's look at the different powers. The Islamic fundamentalists, Iran is still not, to me, the best choice at that point for where Islamic fundamentalism is. But clearly the spark of Islamic fundamentalism has already started. At least the idea of, hey, you know, we're being dominated at this point, post-World War I, in the Near East, by these colonial powers, Britain, France especially. And I think there was some desire to throw that off. And very clearly, where do you look for that? Well, personally, I would look more to Turkey at that point. There was a bit of a resurgence in Turkey, and I think they might make more sense. But okay, we'll pretend Iran makes sense, because at the very least, you could see them as Shia fundamentalism. And that's something that had been kind of quiescent for a while. Communism, hey, you know, this is a poster child right here. Starts in World War I, is huge throughout the 20th century, and it is, you know, part of the bipolar world in the end, at least after World War II. Fascism. I want to hold this one off because I have the most gripes about that, actually, strangely enough. First of all, that it would start in Germany, but I'm willing to pass that because there were definitely fascist currents in Germany from the very beginning of the post-war era. Whereas in Italy, although fascism really took root there first, right after the war, I don't think the feeling of betrayal was quite as strong. I may be mistaken. Okay, we talked about imperialism and what you have to do to kind of make that make some sense. How is that different from capitalism? I don't think it's terribly different, but I think that's okay. Because certainly Britain's role in the world, especially as the premier imperialist power, is a little different. But whereas communism and Islam and capitalism are really, and perhaps fascism, but we'll get to that because that's the trickiest, are perhaps currents that dominated one culture society, and in some cases there were satellites, and there's no problem with that to me, but many of these were really, hey, you are now a capitalist or communist country, and you're now almost a focus of such a feeling. Imperialism doesn't fit that at all. Even if you look at the sort of bright spots of the Commonwealth, you know, Canada and Australia, they aren't expanding imperialist ideals. In fact, imperialism is very, very clearly centered on we are Britain's, you know, special relationship, which doesn't feel the same in terms of an ideological stance, which is what the game claims to be about. I think it fails in that. Fascism. This is the one I have the most trouble with, believe it or not. Mainly, it makes some sense when you're looking at Germany, Italy, the European powers, Turkey, Spain, that show, and certainly the German satellite states, that showed a strong fascist tendency, and perhaps some satellite aspect to Germany, or even Italy, perhaps. What is Japan? I mean, look, World War II, Japan's one of the great powers involved in that war. They're aligned with fascism. No other power, except maybe Islamic fundamentalism, which seems ridiculous, but maybe, no other power seems to fit Japan. Now, because they're in the Axis so closely aligned, I kind of want to make them fascist, but they're not. right? I mean, if anything, they are the true imperialists here. They're the ones who have the dynamic growth of a new empire that they're trying to impose. And that, they don't fit under the imperialists because they're at war with Britain, very clearly. It's two imperialist powers. Do they fit under fascism? Well, no, because fascism wouldn't have spread, it did not spread to Japan through European ideals. Okay, so the last one left is, could they be considered an Islamic fundamentalist power? And that seems absolutely ludicrous, but it does explain how the Islamics can be considered a power that early in the game. Instead of calling them the Islamics, they could just be considered not the other currents. Okay, but then why are you making Iran the poster child for that? I don't know. And again, that's really, to me, where kind of the weak spot is where do you fit Japan? Because it's clearly a key player in the world at this point. And some of the other stuff, it feels like I had to dance a whole lot to try to come up with some kind of historical basis. So I think it doesn't do a great job there. What it does do a decent job of, and this is what surprised me, is in giving some, because of the dynamics and the imbalance at the beginning and perhaps throughout the game, because of the powers that each of the players has, it allows, for example, the imperialists to jump off to the kind of lead that, in a sense, Britain was exhibiting and the Commonwealth pre-World War II. Now, in my game, maybe because I don't know the game well enough to understand how to stop them right away, they got off to that good jump and there was nobody in the way to halt them. We also see the fascists and capitalists producing some pretty powerful positioning. Whereas the communists, I've already discussed in the wrap, I feel like they faltered and I feel like they're almost bound to. Their particular powers don't seem to help them expand at all. Once they expand, they help them defend, but other people, at least my other people, the little pieces of me, had a real fear of communism because of its ability to hold on, its apparent ability to hold on to its own territories better. I was much more worried that the game would end up in more of a stalemate than it did. I've certainly seen worse stalemates in games like Dune, or Diplomacy, where the balance of power really prevents the game from ever passing beyond a certain point. Alright. Play balance? Well, it may be that this is one of those games. I mean, naturally it's not balanced, right? You know, there are certain powers that I think have a natural advantage early on, and other advantages maybe accrue to other powers due to the dynamics of the play. I don't think two powers facing each other are balanced. I think perhaps, my understanding is, that the changes, and each power except imperialism has a change in the country powers, is an attempt to even that out. Now I look at the fascist one, military focused as their option. You begin the game with one tactics advancement. Well, that's their basic. When purchasing tactics throughout the game, you may pay one military influence card and one influence card of any kind. That doesn't sound that powerful. I think that is actually nice. Let's look at some of the others, because I haven't really looked at these. Imperialism doesn't have another one. Communism. Totalitarianism. At the end of the assessment phase, you may replace one opposing influence card with one of your controlled regions with one matching influence card from your hand. A little bit weaker. I'm not sure that makes much difference because you usually will be using your cards for something. Wow, the Islamics have a couple. Jihad, once per turn during the foreign phase as an action, you can replace an opponent's influence card on an independent region with a matching influence card from your hand. Well, that's different. That's seriously different. That sounds more powerful. The opponent cannot deflect this replacement, nor is he protected by advancements. The opponent discards and draws a new card from the top of his deck. Diplomatic relations determines what you can do. However, they pay an additional industry for innovation at a little bit less of a penalty as well. And for capitalism, once per turn you can deflect an opponent's cultural influence. With any type of influence card. Okay, so the difference here is you have to play a card. I don't know if that is going to help balance. I mean, looking at my game, I don't think it would necessarily. So I think you end up with a different scenario, one that I doubt, given, for example, Islam's stronger position from their power, and so at communism's weaker position, I doubt that it terribly will reflect a more historical position. I think the intention there is play balance. I think there's a number of variants for that. For example, bringing 2 regions out at the beginning of the game in 4 or 5 players. In 4 or 5 players, the first 3 players probably get to play an influence card on that first region. The 4th and 5th player don't. If you have 2 regions out there, everybody has some chance to play a card on that first thing, unless they have a very unbalanced hand. Okay, so one of the things that I was going to say is I think my initial thought was that those were in there just for balance. I think that's the intention, but I don't know if they really do that. But I do think that they weaken the historical, the ability to dance around and try to make up the historical potential. Another issue, lots and lots of countries here. And you don't get to use nearly any of them in the game. I mean, I used, what, maybe a third? That's kind of sad because, you know, the feeling is that this is a world-class game. You know, you're not world-class in the sense that it's that good, but in the sense that you're trying to dominate the ideals of the whole world. Now, when you only can bring out, you know, a third of the territories in the world, and World War II didn't leave a lot of major areas unaffected. Certainly more than a third of the world was already in play there, and once you get into the Cold War, I would say even more than that. Almost the entire world was facing some sort of being forced into an alignment of one type or another. So that's kind of a disappointment. I was expecting more of a global reach. I'd compare this to a few games. Out of the ones I've played, the only thing even vaguely like it is Twilight Struggle. And they're just, I mean, I'm going to compare it to the games I compared Twilight Struggle to. Because the fact that that's a 2-player game and is really about a different kind of area control, it just, to me, it doesn't feel at all similar. But I do want to look at the multiplayer Cold War games as kind of the view against this. And there are several things like Summit, Cold War, Superpower. Superpower, in a way, is sort of the poster child for this one, which is to say, they feel somewhat similar in the sense that you're playing cards out of a hand to dominate regions and to get a total control of points, but there isn't really this sort of economic gain other than the cards you draw, and that's not present at all in Superpower. This is a Games Workshop game from back in the 80s. And I think this blows all of them away in terms of gameplay mechanics. The only one I'd question there is Summit may be more interesting than the other two that I'm thinking of. Victory Games' Cold War kind of falls a little flat. Probably one of the weaker offerings by Victory Games. And yeah, Superpower is just a silly game when it comes down to it. There's a lot of die rolling and all kind of crap. So this does not really compare terribly. It doesn't align with any of them, and because those all have this they have this map, you know, and you can choose anywhere to intervene. Cold War has more restrictions that make sense on your intervention. For example, you can intervene anywhere, but some areas physically just, it's too expensive, or there's no payoff for them. In this, however, you have the, oh look, there's Alaska, and everybody can play on it, you know, and this is Alaska we're talking about. I mean, it's almost a state by this point. And it could make sense, but it seems a little historically odd that Alaska would come into play that way. Now, overall, to me, I don't feel like I understand the world that's being represented and pictured in this very well. It doesn't fit well with my image of 20th century politics, power politics. It also doesn't really take into account some things, the three types. I think it's a neat mechanism for a game. I like the unbalance. I think that works nicely. I just wish historically it fit better. You know, it seems like the designer had that as an intention in the game. It's sold in the blurb on the box in that sort of way, I believe. I don't want to... beginning with one global region completely under its sway, each ideology uses military, economic, and cultural influence to purchase advantage. Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, my feeling was there was more of an attempt to reach that kind of historical insight into the world, and that insight is just not there to me. It just doesn't seem to produce it, even at the level of some of the games that I'm not terribly impressed with, like the Victory Games Cold War, which is always disappointing. Summit, which always feels like you have too much flexibility. Yeah. Superpower, which is just silly. It's Monopoly, okay? But this one, again, interesting game, but I just, even with all the dancing I'm trying to do to explain it in my own head, it's just not coming up with that right story to match what I believe is there. And here's another thing. It's called ideology, but I don't feel like an ideology when I'm playing. I don't feel like that's my core. So, for example, in Germany, in the post-war period, there was a major clash of ideologies. It wasn't all fascism. There was, you know, your fascists. There was your Democrats who probably were going to lose, but had a very powerful basis at the beginning. And you had your communists there. You certainly didn't have your Islamic fundamentalists. And you probably didn't have imperialists as terribly different from fascists. Nobody wanted to really restore the monarchy either. I would have been much more interested in a game, I think, that focused more on the ideologies, if it's going to be called ideology, and how they conflicted within individual nations, rather than what feels almost like a great power conflict where the powers are being almost avatars of some ideology that they may have partially espoused. The United States is definitely capitalist. The Soviet Union is definitely communist. But the rest of these different countries had different tendencies. So, for example, in the United States, Huey Long was was a member of a fascist current in the United States. One that showed some very communist ideals as well. But that's the kind of game that I was kind of expecting, something where these ideals were actually fighting rather than something that expressed more a military or a purely nation-based game. And I think that was kind of a disappointment for me. Alright, I'm going to let this go.